Gabby Hayes finally breaks silence on Roy Rogers. Gabby Hayes was born George Francis Gabby Hayes on May 7, 1885, in Stannards, New York. Hayes grew up far from the dusty trails and cattle towns that later became his cinematic home. His early years were marked by a surprising contrast to his later on-screen persona. He was the son of a hotel owner, and for a time he lived a comfortable middle-class life in the northeastern United States. As a young man, Hayes showed a natural flair for performance and storytelling, talents that would later make him one of Hollywood's most endearing character actors. Before entering the film industry, Hayes led a remarkably varied life. He briefly pursued a career in professional baseball and even dabbled in engineering before the allure of the stage drew him to the world of vaudeville. Together with his wife, Olive E. Ireland, he formed a successful stage act that toured across the country during the early 1900s. Their performances were a mix of comedy, music, and sketches, and Hayes quickly became known for his animated facial expressions and natural comic timing. It wasn't until the stock market crash of 1929 wiped out much of his savings that he decided to take a chance on the burgeoning movie industry in California, a move that would forever change his life. Upon his arrival in Hollywood, Hayes found steady work as a character actor during the transition from silent films to talkies. Initially, he appeared in small roles, often playing villains, barkeeps, or townsfolk in early westerns. However, as the 1930s progressed, he began to carve out a niche for himself as the quintessential western sidekick. His transformation into Gabby, the bearded, cantankerous, yet lovable old-timer with a heart of gold, came almost by accident. Hayes himself was a clean-shaven, well-spoken man off-screen, but the persona of Gabby, with his bushy beard, homespun wisdom, and trademark exclamations like "Dern tootin'," captured the imagination of audiences everywhere. In real life, George Gabby Hayes was a far cry from the scruffy, slow-talking, bearded old-timer that audiences grew to adore on the silver screen. Off-camera, Hayes was an intelligent, articulate, and impeccably groomed gentleman, well-read, polished in manner, and always thoughtful in conversation. Yet, Hollywood audiences knew him best as the quintessential grizzled frontier codger, forever muttering colorful expressions like "consarn it," "year dern tootin'," "dadgummit," "dern persnickety female," and "young whippersnapper." His voice, roughened for comic effect, and his unkempt appearance became trademarks of the lovable sidekick archetype, a role he would come to define for generations of Western fans. Hayes's journey into cinematic legend began in earnest between 1935 and 1939, when he took on the role of Windy Halliday, the witty, cantankerous companion to cowboy hero Hopalong Cassidy, portrayed by William Boyd. As Windy, Hayes became an indispensable part of the Hopalong Cassidy series, injecting humor and heart into the rugged landscapes of the Old West. However, in 1939, a salary dispute led him to part ways with Paramount Pictures. It was a risky move for an actor so closely identified with a single role, but Hayes's talent and charisma ensured that he didn't remain idle for long. Soon after, he found a new home at Republic Pictures. Since Paramount retained the rights to the name Windy Halliday, Republic simply rechristened him Gabby Whitaker, a name that would become iconic in its own right. The transformation was little more than a formality. Gabby Whitaker was, in essence, the same endearing, quick-witted sidekick Hayes had perfected, and audiences welcomed him with open arms. Between 1939 and 1946, Gabby Hayes appeared in more than 40 films for Republic, cementing his reputation as the most beloved sidekick in Western cinema. His rugged charm and comedic timing added depth and warmth to the adventures of Hollywood's greatest cowboy stars. During this prolific period, Hayes worked alongside Roy Rogers an astonishing 44 times, a partnership that became one of the most recognizable in movie history. He also teamed up with Gene Autry in 7 films and with Wild Bill Elliott in 14, often under the skilled direction of Joseph Kane, who helmed 34 of Hayes's pictures. Beyond Republic, Gabby's talents caught the attention of other Western icons as well. He appeared 6 times with the stalwart Randolph Scott and no fewer than 15 times with the legendary John Wayne, not always as a comic sidekick, but sometimes as a tough, even villainous character. One of their most memorable collaborations came in Raoul Walsh's 1940 classic Dark Command, where Hayes played Wayne's loyal sidekick in a film that also featured a young Roy Rogers in a supporting role. The movie became a showcase of Hayes's range, his ability to balance humor and heroism, grit and good-heartedness. By this point, Gabby Hayes had become more than a character name. It was a beloved institution in American cinema. Despite his sidekick label, Hayes was very much a star in his own right. His popularity led to his own television program, The Gabby Hayes Show, which aired in the early 1950s and introduced a new generation of young viewers to his folksy charm. On the show, he presented old Western films and stories, speaking directly to children with the same warmth and humor that had endeared him to moviegoers for decades. In many ways, this television work helped bridge the gap between classic Western cinema and the emerging medium of television, ensuring that his influence would continue long after the heyday of the Western film. For decades, fans of classic Westerns have wondered what really went on behind the scenes between the legendary Roy Rogers and his unforgettable sidekick, George Gabby Hayes. The two men shared the screen in some of the most beloved cowboy films of the 1930s and 1940s, forming a duo that defined the golden age of Westerns. Hayes, known for his grizzled beard, twangy voice, and comical frontier expressions, rarely spoke about his working relationships in Hollywood. But in a rare and deeply personal reflection late in his life, Gabby Hayes finally broke his silence on Roy Rogers. And what he said reveals the deep respect, admiration, and complexity that existed between the two stars. Roy was more than just a cowboy hero to the public, Hayes once remarked thoughtfully. He was a man who carried that same honesty and decency off the screen. What you saw in those pictures, the courage, the humility, the smile that could disarm the toughest outlaw, that was all Roy Hayes's words captured the essence of Rogers's appeal, not only as a performer but as a human being. Rogers represented a kind of heroism that transcended Hollywood. To Hayes, he wasn't just another co-star. He was a symbol of American virtue, a man who believed in hard work, faith, and family. Hayes went on to explain how their friendship had developed naturally despite their different backgrounds. "We came from opposite ends of the road," he said with a chuckle. "Roy was this clean-cut singing cowboy, and I was the scruffy old-timer who looked like he'd been chewing cactus for breakfast. But somehow it worked. He made the kids cheer, and I made their folks laugh." Their chemistry became one of the most recognizable trademarks in Western cinema. Whether they were riding the dusty trails, chasing bandits, or trading witty banter, the connection between Roy Rogers and Gabby Hayes felt genuine because it was genuine. Behind the cameras, their relationship was grounded in mutual respect. Hayes often admired Rogers's professionalism and dedication. "Roy never complained," Hayes recalled. "Even when we were out in the heat, sweating through our shirts and covered in dust, he stayed cheerful. He'd crack a joke or start humming a tune just to keep everyone's spirits up." That kind of leadership left a lasting impression on Hayes, who had worked with countless stars during his long career. To him, Rogers stood apart, not just as a performer, but as a man of character. Yet Hayes also acknowledged the challenges of working in the fast-paced film industry, where fame could easily overshadow friendship. "We didn't always see eye to eye," he admitted. "Sometimes I'd grumble about the scripts or the way the studio wanted more songs and less action. Roy would laugh and tell me, 'Gabby, the kids love the songs.' And he was right. He always knew what the audience wanted. Their occasional creative disagreements never eroded their bond. In fact, Hayes credited those moments with strengthening their partnership. "He taught me patience," Hayes reflected, "and I think I taught him how to have a little fun with the rough edges." When asked later in life about the legacy of their collaboration, Hayes's tone turned sentimental. "Those pictures we made, they weren't just entertainment," he said softly. "They gave people hope." The country was going through tough times, and folks needed a hero they could believe in. Roy gave them that. I was just lucky enough to ride alongside him. It was clear that Hayes viewed their work not as mere show business, but as a contribution to American culture at a moment when optimism was sorely needed. Even after Hayes left the Roy Rogers series, he never uttered a bitter word about his former partner. In fact, he continued to speak warmly of Rogers whenever asked. He treated everyone on set with respect, from the cameraman to the wrangler. "That's the mark of a real star," Hayes said proudly. "And I'll tell you something. When you've worked in Hollywood as long as I did, you don't forget the ones who stay true to themselves." In his final years, as Hayes looked back over a career that spanned radio, film, and television, he often mentioned Rogers as one of the finest men he ever worked with. "Roy made me look good," he joked, "and that's no small feat when you're a scruffy old coot like me." But behind the humor was real affection, a deep, enduring appreciation for a partnership that had captured the hearts of millions. When asked what he would say to Roy if he could speak to him again, Hayes paused for a long moment before replying, "I'd thank him for the laughs, the trails, the songs, and the friendship. We might have played cowboy and sidekick, but in my book, Roy Rogers was the real deal, the kind of man America could be proud of." Gabby Hayes' heartfelt reflections finally gave fans a glimpse into one of Hollywood's most cherished friendships. His words painted a portrait of two men united by purpose, humor, and respect, a bond that endures in every frame of film they ever shared. And even now, long after both men have ridden into the sunset, their partnership remains one of the most beloved in Western history, a timeless reminder of loyalty, laughter, and the true spirit of the American frontier. Following the heartbreaking death of his beloved wife, Olive E. Ireland Hayes, on July 5, 1957, George "Gabby" Hayes entered a quiet and reflective period of his life. The loss deeply affected him, as Olive had been not only his lifelong companion, but also the driving force behind much of his career. She had managed his finances, negotiated contracts, and stood by him through the unpredictable world of show business. After her passing, Hayes found solace in familiar surroundings, retreating to his ranch on Toluca Lake in California, a property that had once been a haven of laughter, friendship, and shared dreams. The ranch, nestled among the serene landscapes of the San Fernando Valley, provided him with a peaceful refuge where he could be close to nature, away from the bright lights of Hollywood that had defined so much of his earlier life. Here, surrounded by his cherished memories and mementos from his film and television days, Hayes spent countless hours reminiscing about the golden years of Western cinema and the camaraderie he shared with stars like Roy Rogers, John Wayne, and Hopalong Cassidy. By the late 1960s, however, Hayes's health began to decline. Early in 1969, he was admitted to St. Joseph Hospital in Burbank, California, after suffering complications from cardiovascular disease. The once vigorous cowboy who had spent decades portraying the rugged and hardy sidekick of the Old West was now facing the frailty of age. Yet even in the hospital, those who visited him recalled his characteristic warmth and gentle humor. Nurses and doctors described him as polite, cheerful, and grateful for the care he received. Hayes often reflected on his long life and career, expressing gratitude for the opportunities Hollywood had given him and for the fans who had never forgotten his contributions to the Western genre. Though the illness gradually weakened him, he faced his condition with dignity and acceptance, much like the stoic frontier characters he had brought to life on screen. On February 9, 1969, Gabby Hayes passed away peacefully at the age of 83, closing the final chapter of a life that had spanned from the era of silent films to the golden age of television. His death marked the end of an era for many Western enthusiasts, who remembered him not only as the quintessential grizzled sidekick, but also as a symbol of honesty, loyalty, and humor in a genre that celebrated those very traits.